but we're going to talk about geopolitics and cyber implications. So the panel we'll have today has experience with national security, cyber crimes, intellectual property, dozens of years of experience in these topics. And so I'd like to bring them up to the stage. We'll have our moderator, which is Suzanne Kelly. She's the CEO and publisher of the Cipher Brief. Welcome, Suzanne. We have John Carlin. He's a former Assistant Attorney General in the U.S. Department of Justice in the National Security Division. Welcome, John. We have Kiersten Todt. She's the Managing Director of the Cyber Readiness Institute. She's a resident scholar of the University of Pittsburgh Institute for Cyber Law, Policy, and Security. Welcome, Kiersten. And lastly, we have Dan Keyserling, who's the COO of Jigsaw. So thank you for the first panel.
Wonderful. So thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. I would be remiss if I started without thanking Mark Testoni. He was one of the first private sector leaders that I sought out when I launched the Cipher Brief, really because we need more of the messages that he shares. It was his commitment and dedication to hiring veterans back then that caught my attention, and now I could not thank him more for choosing this topic, because I feel like a lot of us are watching what's happening with the divides, are watching what's happening with the adversaries, how technology is helping them, how much we need to come together. And I don't think that we could be talking about ways to come together enough. So I really thank Mark and really thank NS2 for choosing this topic today. And I thank my guests as well for being here. So the panel, I'll calm down in a minute. I get very nervous in front of people. The panel today, you all look so friendly though, is exploring the dynamics, the motivations, and the impact of cyber attacks that are fueled by geopolitical events. And connecting these two things is obviously critical to understanding how we're going to be able to mitigate these risks, both in the private sector and by government in the future. If you think about the tensions around the world right now, Iran obviously increased tensions just in the last several months, all based around the JCPOA, what's going to happen there. That was upped recently by drone attacks in Saudi Arabia, and the United States working to help prevent that in the future. So people who I've talked to in the national security space are very concerned about Iran launching more cyber attacks, and we'll talk about that. Also North Korea, very unsatisfied with the state of talks regarding denuclearization with the United States. What might they do? We've seen them perpetrate cyber crimes in the past. Are we going to see more of that? And then Russia. It was really interesting. Reuters reported just not very long ago, I think about a week ago or a few days ago, that Russian hackers had piggybacked on Iranian cyber espionage operations in multiple countries, a lot of them targeting private sector companies. So we're starting to see some new, new characteristics of some of these cyber attacks, John, that we need to keep an eye on. So with that, I'm going to start with John. He wrote a book recently called Dawn of the Code War, which was I think we were one of the first interviews when your book came out. It's an excellent book. You're such a great storyteller in terms of helping us understand what the threat is. So let's talk about describing China's approach to espionage, to the 1,000 grains of sand philosophy, which is what you talked about in your book, the geopolitical intelligence equivalent of death by 1,000 cuts. How does China's approach compare to other adversarial nation states, John?
No, and I want to echo your thanks to Mark and NS2, and really discussing China, I think, is one of the reasons why it is so important to be working together and across boundaries here, because they are. I think what distinguishes China from Russia, North Korea, and Iran, the so-called Big Four that have been identified by the intelligence community as the top nation-state threats, not just to our country, but really rogue actors affecting the world when it comes to cybersecurity. What makes China unique is the way in which they have blended strategically their use of cyber vulnerabilities as part of a larger strategic plan targeted largely at the private sector in order to transfer wealth. And they were kind enough to be open about it, at least until recently. They had a plan called Made in China 2025. And if you looked at where they were targeting not just their cyber attacks, but also their use of trained operatives in order to recruit inside your companies to flip the same techniques that we had long seen them use against us in government, they were combining that along with trade policy to target certain sectors. And where we saw spikes in cyber attacks and recruitment activities mapped quite neatly with what they had identified in their public Made in China 2025 plan. And that's why I think you've seen a shift starting in 2014 with the first case of its kind, the indictment of 5 members of the People's Liberation Army, a specialized unit 61398, in the government's approach to this threat, which is, number one, we need to figure out who did it. Well, that didn't used to be very hard with China because they were so noisy in terms of the techniques they were using when they hit your companies. Number two, though, is to take it out of the shadows where it has been so long the default for those of us in government, with good reason. You know, when I was in government, we also brought a case against the Russian illegal operation that became the plot of the Americans. And so when you were thinking of it as a Cold War problem, the technique that you used was, let's watch this family try to live normal United States lives and pretend that they're Americans for years without disrupting, and collect information on their tradecraft. Instead of disrupting as well, we might pass them information that we know is not true, because if we disrupt, they're going to come up with another plot. The problem with what we were seeing on cyber, and China in particular, was that they were so noisy, they were hitting every company across every sector, that we really weren't learning much about their tradecraft. All we were learning is that we're being robbed blind, and that we're costing billions and billions of dollars, and if we don't stop this now, companies are going out of business or going bankrupt. What that also showed, though, and allowed us to make public in that case, was that what they're going after are things like Westinghouse is about to do a joint venture with a Chinese partner, and the night before they go in and steal the technical design specifications for the lead pipe they were going to lease. No military value, just money. And so the next day they don't need to lease. Or to use another example from that case, SolarWorld. Here was a company, a US subsidiary of a German multinational, and what they targeted on the system was the least protected part of the system, the email on the system. They observed email traffic talking about pricing, and this going to their whole of government approach. They then used that information to feed it to that sector who price dumped at exactly the point they knew would cause the most pain for SolarWorld. They watched as SolarWorld went bankruptcy, and then to add insult to injury, when SolarWorld sued for unfair trade practices, they stole the whole litigation strategy. And we put an attachment, just to end on that case, that showed this was activity that started at 9 in the morning, unlike you get an earlier start to the day, kudos. Then went from 9 to noon Beijing time. It then decreased from noon to 1. Apparently they take a lunch break. It increased again from 1 to 6, decreased overnight on weekends and on Chinese holidays. So the former prosecutor in me would call that circumstantial evidence that this is coming from China. But also think about it and why it's so important we're addressing the topics that we are today. Think about it. This was the second largest military in the world. This was a unit who put their uniform each day, and from 9 to roughly 6, hacked into, and this unit specifically targeted private companies for the benefit of their competitors overseas. There is no way that we can address that problem leaving each company alone and blaming the victim when they fall prey to the second largest military in the world. That demands a government response, and it also demands that we work across the government and private sector to address this problem.
I think bridging that gap with the private sector too, and that information sharing is such a key point that we hear over and over again. I do want to remind everyone that there are microphones in the audience if you might want to identify them and start thinking about a couple of questions. The last few minutes, we're going to invite you to ask questions as well. Kiersten, same question to you. How does China compare with other adversaries when it comes to cyber?
Well, first of all, thanks very much, Suzanne. Thanks to NS2. And John's experience, obviously, as you look at what's happened, I want to take a step back, because what we can see and the specifics of what John lays out are so important to understand how this environment has evolved. So when we specifically look at what China has achieved over the last couple of decades, there is a success and a creativity to what they're doing and how they're doing it. And one of the things that John points out, which is important, is that they have demonstrated a patience. And the activity of that patience is something that we don't see in a lot of our adversaries so strongly. But I want to use the example of 5G to sort of understand this. So what they've been able to do from China as an adversary is to exploit the open environment of the West for their own economic incentives. And this is something that we're very challenged with from a Western mentality, because we believe strongly that obviously the idea of an open internet is what's right. What China has done very effectively is they've created a very solid alternative in a closed internet. They have one app for shopping, banking, chatting, whatever you need to do. What they've done is they've created one regulatory body. So when a technology company is looking to get approval, they essentially go to a building. Their theme is to win primacy. So when you think about all of that, what we come back with is, but why would anyone not want an open environment? When you are looking to build out 5G, and Mark talked about this a little bit earlier, when you're looking to be on par with where technology and innovation is going, you want to have those tools. So Tanzania, Vietnam, countries like them are much more willing to take the cheaper closed route that regulates content, that prohibits content, in order to be part of this environment sooner rather than later. So as China looks at the long game, it's important for Western countries to understand that while our ideals are our ideals, they may not be those of other countries. And I think, just playing off of what John said at the end too, this is an important opportunity for the United States to lead globally. We can't do this on our own. We need to be working with our partners across the world, trade partners, economic partners, in order to really be looking at this effectively. China is not a benign competitor. John's stories show that so explicitly, and his experience. And as we continue to see what's happening, we have to understand that this is something, this is a country we need to be looking at much more thoughtfully and deliberately, because to the point, the tools, the mechanisms for adversarial action are only improving on their part.
Just pile on with one,
Sure.
Just in terms of their patience, which is, think about some of the, when you're thinking about AI and the race for the development of better algorithms to analyze bulk data, and then look back at what we've seen in terms of Chinese activity. We saw this enormous theft of government records in the Office of Personnel Management. I know my daughter's first piece of mail, which she was very excited about receiving because it had her name on it, was to inform her that her identity had been stolen. We also saw China targeting places like Anthem and stealing personal identifiable information in bulk, hitting a hotel industry. And why? I'm not sure today that they know what they're going to do with the vast repository of data from different sources that they've collected. But now that they have it, what they can do is get better and better and more sophisticated algorithms, banging them against that very rich data set. And what they're thinking, I think, is that years from now, as they perfect those algorithms, as they move towards AI, they're going to garner insights that they don't even know what they are today, and get a strategic advantage over the US and the rest of the Western world, where it can be difficult due to regulation, for good reason, on privacy, to gather a data set that large and figure out how to manipulate it.
And trying to think like the adversary and be prepared for that several years down the road is a challenge as well, something to keep in mind. So let's talk a little bit about narrowing that gap then. We've heard, John, that government can't do this alone. Dan, your work at Jigsaw is focused on both conducting research and building technology that directly addresses some of these global security challenges that we talked about. Give us a sense of what you're seeing on the private sector side, and what should industry be doing to address it?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me echo my gratitude for being here. The answer I'm going to give is probably about disinformation and about broad general threats. But before I get there, how many of you use two-factor authentication on your personal email accounts? Okay, well, to the 3/4 of the room that didn't raise your hand, please, that's, I think, the biggest threat that we're perceiving. The sort of generalized vulnerability to sort of everyday threat vectors and your average quotidian attacks that end up leading to greater vulnerability. So anyway, use your favorite search engine, look for advanced protection, or come see me in the lunch break. But so Jigsaw tries to forecast technological threats a couple of years in advance. And one of the issues that we've been studying quite a lot lately is the evolution of disinformation. And one of the themes of our discussion so far today has been the incorporation of these kinds of attacks into strategic statecraft, espionage, political, military, economic efforts by states. And we've seen that with disinformation too. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of the more commonly known examples of that. But these tactics are proliferating. So tactics and strategies that are pioneered by states end up becoming available not just to smaller actors, but really to anybody who wants to go and purchase these on the dark web or take these set of tactics and replicate them. So on the technology industry side, we're focused on, first of all, understanding the architecture of these threats. What does a disinformation campaign look like? What are the component pieces? How can you develop the capability to detect certain signals that suggest that a campaign is coordinated? How do you develop your capabilities to understand what is the target of it? What is the origin of it? And with that detection capability, you can start to think about technological mitigations to that. So we're in the process of doing both of those things. Jigsaw experiments with technology to sort of intervene and exemplify how technology can play a role in mitigating some of those threats.
That's fantastic. Kiersten, you've worked you've worked in government, academia, and the private sector. Obviously, there's got to be a role for industry to play here besides just sitting around waiting to be the next victim. What is that role?
So I think it's an important point right now, particularly because when we look at technology platforms across the board, we understand that they now have an impact on our national and economic security in ways that they were not innovated to do. And definitely want to hear more from Dan on this because I think there's so much that's been done in this space. But when you develop a technology, so a couple of years ago, I served as executive director of President Obama's Independent Commission on Cybersecurity. And one of the big questions that we were confronted with was if you develop a technology, but then it's used for purposes other than what you intended it to do, what is the responsibility of the company to then manage that use? And even if that use isn't malicious, but if it's just beyond what you were set up to do. And while that seemed like almost a romantic discussion at the time, because it was, very contained in what people were talking about, we now see that this has truly happened across the board with technology platforms. And so what is the role of industry now as an economic and national security, as an entity that impacts, to work with government? So we're not saying, and we've talked about this, whether it was the protection of critical infrastructure following the presidential directive in 1996, 97, as we looked at it in 1999, we're not talking about anybody doing this on their own. What we're talking about is industry and government working together. And the challenge is that when we look at protecting our critical infrastructure, and typically we look at these traditional sectors, we're looking to historical models to inform how we work today and into the future. Those historical models don't work. They're great to inform what's worked. I mean, we talk about different tools, even recently, the NIST framework, C2M2 in the Department of Energy, other entities. But when you look forward, what we need to do is be able to work with companies, tech platforms, to ensure that we're not suffocating innovation, that we're not stifling invention, but we're looking at how to create a secure infrastructure. So the Department of Homeland Security is working pretty effectively with companies like Dan's and others around the election. We're seeing some important collaboration and understanding how to exchange information, but this is just a starting point. And as we look into the future, it's not just the platforms that we're talking about now, it's understanding that cloud is part of our infrastructure. The cloud is going to be something that we have to secure, and we're all a little bit scared by it. I heard somebody say recently, the cloud is like heaven. Everybody wants to go there. They just don't want to go there today. And I think that that's really important as we're looking at what we're doing with this, because we have to catch up to where we are. And the conversations around what need to be done have to move into action. And part of that is industry and government working together before something happens, pre-event, collaborating, understanding where strengths are and where weaknesses, but also looking to create a new model for how we protect the infrastructure, which isn't just the hardened physical assets that we see on the side of the road, but really is our digital infrastructure.
I'd like to kind of bring us up to speed, too, on kind of current events and what you're currently seeing. So John and Kiersten, this question is for both of you. What are the key differences you're seeing in the threat actors from the time you were in government to today?
I'd say the number one trend, the number one difference is something that Dan touched on, which is the blend that is occurring between, it was a trend we started seeing, and we had the first case of its kind of a terrorist who hacked into a company for criminal gain originally to make $500 by extorting a retailer that they had stolen personally identifiable information, and he really did want the $500. but then on the back end became friends with one of the most notorious terrorists of the world, Junaid Hussain, a British citizen who'd been arrested for computer hacking, gets radicalized in prison, moves to Raqqa, Syria, where he's located at the heart of the Islamic State of the Levant. He convinces this guy Farizi, who's in Malaysia, to give him the information that he stole in order to extort for $500. And Junaid Hussain could care less about the $500. What he does is what the Islamic State does. You know, at the time they were using rape as a political tool. They were putting women and children into slavery, and they were killing Muslims and non-Muslims alike with impunity. So he takes this information that was entrusted by customers to their retailer, and he uses it to create a kill list, seeing if he can identify those who look like government employees, .gov, .mil, and he curates that kill list, and then using Twitter, he blasts that kill list back to the United States and says, kill these people by name, by address, where they live. Because there was effective working together, which is the rarity, you know, it's the exception still, not the rule, and this company worked with government is why I can go into so many details of what happened in this case. And we were able to arrest Farizi in Malaysia. Turns out he was a 21-year-old Kosovo extremist who moved to Malaysia in part to get better access to broadband so he could hack. And Farizi had only met Junaid Hussain, again, through social media. They never met in the real world. Junaid Hussain convinced him through Twitter to give him that stolen information. And Farizi was actually brought to Virginia, not so far from here, and ultimately prosecuted as serving time at 20 years in prison. Junaid Hussain was outside even the long arm of law enforcement, and certainly outside the reach of what you can do as a private company. He was killed in an openly acknowledged military strike by Central Command. And after that, I can tell you, as the lead official overseeing the prosecution of international terrorism, we saw a marked decrease in what had been our top threat of international terrorism cases inside the United States. We brought more in a 2-year period than we'd ever brought, where they were targeting particularly 21-year-olds and younger. Over a third of our cases were 21 or younger. It was because of the success of Junaid Hussain and his cadre, and because of this military strike, they were taken off the battlefield, and we saw a decrease inside the United States. But that was the first case where we charged computer hacking on the criminal side with terrorism. That blend between terrorists getting access to what criminals have stolen and most actually prevalent is nation-state actors doing things, you know, ranging from Russia now. They took a criminal who did things like change the Yahoo search engine so that if you did a search, it redirected you to an erectile dysfunction site, and then he took a portion of the proceeds. So not a national security threat, I think. But they, when we asked for help in arresting this crook, Balan, what we saw is the very unit that we were to cooperate with on child porn cases said, we're not going to cooperate. In fact, we're going to sign him up as an intelligence asset. And that's what they did. So he kept doing things like stealing the largest amount of email addresses in a single computer hack, hundreds of millions of email addresses. And he was doing it to spam, to make a buck. But the Russian intelligence assets used that same trove of information when they were planning to do the Ukrainian invasion. And they looked for government employees to see who they could flip if they could get embarrassing email traffic. That accelerated blend between what the sophistication on the criminal side of the house, nation-state actors, and also nation-state actors using their apparatus, their toolkits, in order to commit crimes just to make a buck on their own, makes it very hard on the defensive side to do attribution, which I'm increasingly seeing. I'll give one last example, which is just Iranian actors. So we had prosecuted Iranian actors for doing distributed denial of service attacks against the financial sector. Affected tens of thousands of public-facing websites, hit 47 different banks. It cost hundreds of millions of dollars to consumers. And we saw that those same groups, when we did the indictment, had done things like hack into the sluice control systems of the Bowman Dam so that they could operate remotely the dam and open it up to flood the surrounding area. Now, as it happens, the dam wasn't working. It was down for physical maintenance, but I think you'll agree, our crumbling infrastructure should not be our first line of defense against cyber adversaries. but those were actions on behalf of the state. Some of those same Iranian actors who were prosecuted more recently, the Mabna group, I'm seeing very frequently now attack private companies for what looks like pure commercial gain. They're just making a buck, and they're doing things like password spraying attacks, where they'll try using a stolen password in rapid succession against all the accounts of a company. If they get in, they extort you for if you want your intellectual property back or for other reasons, or sometimes they put ransomware in using the same intrusion. But they seem to be operating, again, purely on the criminal side. I think they're a good recent example of that blended threat.
Yeah.
Building off of what Dan was talking about the hybrid, and as well as John, I think the key here is the exploitation of vulnerabilities when we look at what the actors are. So it's as much about what the actors are doing, but it's also about the vulnerabilities that exist that they're exposing. So the first one is if you look at what the Department of Homeland Security is doing around securing industrial control systems, that's because our industrial control systems are legacy infrastructure, and they're extremely vulnerable. So it's how do you catch up with where those vulnerabilities are. But playing on the point, I want to talk about what John referenced regarding AI, and Dan mentioned this a little bit. When you look at what our most critical data, what our most critical asset is today, it's data, right? It's the data that we have, it's the data that we're collecting. And the challenge is we're collecting data legally in amounts that we've never seen before, but we're also seeing our adversaries collect that data. And when we get all excited about the future of artificial intelligence, the future of machine learning, the future of automation, what we forget in that exuberance is that the effectiveness and the success of those technologies are dependent upon the data that goes into them. So one of the big concerns that I have when you're looking into the future is not poisoning the data sets. How do we ensure that the integrity of that data that we're talking about building our infrastructure on, growing our infrastructure, not only isn't poisoned, isn't manipulated, that the integrity is something that we can stand by. So the actors, and John references what the different actors are doing, and that's important. I think the other key piece to this is really understanding where our weaknesses are and how they can be exploited. This goes, again, I think, to the other point that I was referencing earlier around industry-government collaboration, because cyber is the only domain where we ask private companies to defend themselves. And so being able to work with companies, these private sector companies that are doing so much, what they're collecting, their engagements globally, that are so effective, we have to figure out how to work with them in order to create not just effective relationships, but also important security.
Dan, I'm very interested to know whether you're seeing an uptick in the data weaponization and these coordination campaigns.
Yes, we are. Let me just echo what Kiersten was saying, that I think part of what we're doing here and part of what Jigsaw endeavors to do is to bridge that divide between the people who understand the tools and the tactics and the people who really deeply understand these issues. I think that the more that those two groups of people talk to each other, the more we can have a shared public conversation about vulnerabilities, threats, opportunities. But to your question, we absolutely are. We're seeing an increase in sophistication, and we're also seeing a worrying trend of spikes in the intensity of attacks around important events in the world, whether it's elections, most acutely, or major political events, or protests, internet shutdowns. Anytime there's sort of a tension in society, we see an uptick in all kinds of attacks, whether it's denial of service attacks, specific targeted attacks towards individuals, journalists, political leaders, activists, and of course, the disinformation problem becomes really acute whenever there's sort of a big public conversation happening. So I think the way that we think about addressing that is, first of all, proactively. Before elections occur, go out to these places all around the world, wherever they're hosting elections, meet with political parties, meet with civic institutions, meet with individual political organizations, get them equipped with basic cybersecurity tools like two-factor authentication. I'll plug it again. But other tools as well. Journalism also becomes a target. During military campaigns, during elections, we've seen the incorporation of targeted DDoS attacks against news organizations in forward military theaters to try to deprive a little bit of that frontline reporting that can reveal what's going on in areas where reporting isn't abundant. Obviously, disinformation is a big problem, sort of in competition with journalism. So the answer to your question is yes, absolutely. We're seeing an increase in the frequency and the intensity of these attacks around major world events.
Okay, I want to remind you all that we have just a little over 10 minutes left, so if you do have questions, and I know you must have questions for these experts up here, please stand up. I will promise not to make you stand at those microphones too long before we reach out and allow you to ask your question. John, I'd like to ask you, have you experienced a shift in how the US government interacts with the private sector now that you're on the other side?
Yeah. Well, one thought on that is I think the government has gotten better at switching from the mentality that we had that by default what we're learning should be kept secret, and starting to incentivize in the security agencies, FBI and Secret Service on the law enforcement side, but also National Security Agency and others, to incentivize speaking publicly about the threats, not just sharing technical indicator information, but also trying to give strategic depth and richness as to how it might be exploited. That said, seeing it from the private sector and side, working with clients now, there's a huge gap between what boardrooms and C-suites are seeing as the threat picture and what I know the true threat picture is. And we are nowhere, we are not moving at the speed with which we need to move to address the gap in knowledge between the government and the private sector. And I think of it a little bit as when you think about what we did after September 11th, where we realized that we had unnecessarily lost the lives of thousands of civilians because we failed to share information effectively across the law enforcement and intelligence divide within and between governments. We spent billions of dollars. We created new institutions, Department of Homeland Security, Director of National Intelligence, the National Counterterrorism Center, the division I led at Justice, the National Security Division, all around that problem set. We're catching up a little bit at cyber, I think it's sharing across law enforcement intelligence, but the fundamental problem we face now is not sharing within governments and between governments, it's sharing between the government and the private sector, and then incentivizing the sharing of information back. We need the same type of resources and dedicated attention to fix that problem, and we need to do it now before we're doing it in response to a terrible incident.
So I guess the really big question, and I'll allow each of you to offer your opinion because you come with such great different backgrounds and perspectives, is how do we get there? There are so many different agencies now that deal with different aspects of cyber. It can be very confusing from the industry side. Who do I call? Who has resources that can help me? How do we share that information? What's the first step to get there to better information sharing?
I'll throw out one, which is we should have a cyber 911. And you're seeing this rolled out right now as a pilot in one city, but every individual and company should know if I go to this one place with the report of an attack and what I'm seeing, the government will figure out how to share and access that information.
And that might be the FBI right now, right? Would be like the lead agency to take that call and then share information as needed within government? Is that how that would work?
Yeah, they have something that doesn't have great brand, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, or IC3. So think about that when you're talking to your grandma about like where she should be reporting an incident.
I like 911 better.
It's not going to have the ease with which we need to make that reporting. And then on the back end, state and locals don't have the funding to work off that information, and it's not currently shared as it should be in government. And then one other issue, because I just have to plug it out before we do workforce, which is, I know we all agree, there's a huge workforce gap. And when you think about what Dan was identifying right now, I think in some ways we focus too much on the technical skills that form that cybersecurity workforce gap. But really the talent that we need is not just bits and bytes. It's thinking about things like, if I know the Russians are going to attack my campaign, I'm never going to keep them out. But what I might do is what Macron did when he was running for president of France, is assume they're going to get into my system and do something creative, like I'm going to put some fake email along with real email into the system. I'm going to wait till they hack me, and then when they dump and try to use the media to complete their campaign, I'm going to say, hey, some of what you have is fake, and I'm not going to tell you which is which. And it worked. Macron got elected. In order to incentivize that, the Aspen Institute, the group that I chair at the Aspen Institute, is announcing today that 15 companies have signed up on how to address the skills gap, including Google, along with Apple, IBM, Northrop, others, to endorse becoming creative about how we're posting these jobs. You don't need a 4-year BA. The NSA has already moved away from one in order to get the right talent. You can have community college and other backgrounds as long as you train on the job. Changing the wording so that we stop having wording that has been proven again and again to decrease diversity, to keep women from applying to these jobs, and relying on putting job postings that require certifications, that if we rely on these certifications, you're only going to have people 20 years in. We don't have enough people who are 20 years in. So you need to open up at the front end, the aperture, so you get more people applying that we can train to tackle these new threats.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes each. How do we narrow this gap?
So a couple things. I think the first thing that John referenced, government responds well when there's a disaster. What we don't, when you look at our response to 9/11, to healthcare, to other things, when something fails, we respond well. What we haven't learned yet is how to work together before something happens. DoD has a great playbook in pre-event planning. We need to be thinking about that. The second piece is we're very focused on federal government, but a lot of this activity is going to succeed at the state level. One of the things that I learned through the ransomware is my first response when I understood what was going on was, well, how can the states not know about this patching? How can they be so behind the times? Then you start talking to the state operators. They literally didn't have the inventory. They didn't have the resources to do things like that. It's up to the federal government to be working with the states to ensure that that exists, because we're not going to actually be able to do this effectively just with a federal policy. The only way it's going to work is if we're working with our state level cyber security officers, et cetera. We have to be investing in the states in their cyber role. And the third is, and looking at all of this, we were talking through, workforce and supply chain. What we're remembering and understanding now is that we still don't have the basics down. And so under the heading of nonprofits that we're advocating for, Aspen, I'll talk about the Cyber Readiness Institute for a moment, because it was started as a follow-on to the commission to work with small businesses. We have to do more with supply chain security and offering the resources and the expertise to small businesses, because they're parts of the global value chain. And going to that point about our most vulnerable assets being exploited, right now those are small businesses. And so investing in small business security and investing in cultures of security where you're focused on the human, I would argue that every individual this day and age is part of the cyber workforce. So each of us has a responsibility and accountability for security, and we need to be helping the small businesses as well as all the entities that are parts of global supply chains to do better.
Well, with a few minutes, I agree with everything that John and Kiersten said, and I think John spoke especially well of the gap between the boardroom and the situation room, and I think that is essentially the gap that needs to be filled with everything that's been discussed so far. But I think one of the things that we really focus on is publishing and open sourcing and creating the space for shared conversations around these issues. Events like these, proliferating the opportunities for people with really different sets of experiences to come together and talk about shared conflicts and problems and vulnerabilities. A lot of the space where we talk about sort of digital threats or cyber actors happens in secret. A lot of it is sort of contained within a very narrow cross-section of both the technology industry and the national security establishment, or even government, public policy. So creating a bit of a broader space, I think, in the public conversation and even in the sort of semi-public conversation in spaces like these, where people can really talk about what they're experiencing, where misconceptions around threat actors exist, and then what we can do collectively, collaboratively to address them.
And I think we have a couple of great takeaways today, right? Set up two-factor authentication, right, on all of your accounts.
Thank you, yes.
Change your password, which is obviously the thing that everybody says, and I think very few people actually do. So that might be a good thing to go home this afternoon or do during the break. And don't use the same password for everything. These very basic things, like you said, will help get us a little bit closer to where we need to be with narrowing the gaps. So, all right, I'm giving everybody one last chance. I know you haven't had enough caffeine. Does anybody have one final question before we go? We have one over here, sir. If you don't mind, just identify yourself, please. Thank you.
Sure. Good morning. My name is William Kilmer. I'm with a venture capital fund called C5 Capital. And first of all, thank you for this very timely panel. I think this is excellent information. My question maybe is a little bit targeted towards John, but I'm open to everybody commenting. John, given the concept that you talked about private industry understanding the full picture of the threats, how important is it for organizations to understand attribution and knowing who their adversary is as part of that big picture? And especially given organizations' lack of skills that they have right now and the talent gap, how do they acquire that if that is important for them to understand specifically who is attacking them and whether or not there's a nation state that's behind that?
Can I make one comment and then you tell me if I'm wrong or not? So the former deputy director of the NSA, Rick Leggett, said to me at one point, we had just so many companies coming to us at NSA thinking they knew who had launched an attack against their company, and 90+% of the time they were wrong. So you can imagine, if we talk about like cyber mercenaries and all of this, what would happen if you were wrong? Okay, right or wrong?
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And it is vitally important to have a mature risk strategy the way you would in any other sector, particularly when you're getting up to the C-suite. So you're outside of the IT and they're trying to decide, where should I make investments in the company? How should I respond and should I go public? And what should I say when I say something publicly about an incident? How do you do that when you have no idea on attribution or who it is that's targeting you? And learning about who it is that's targeting you and why they're targeting you can give you insight. Right now, most companies, I think, default to that which is required by regulation. So they think the top risk may be privacy information. Even companies where the personally identifiable information they have is employee information, but they're not thinking about disruption of their product or attacks on the integrity of their data. If they knew who the threat actor is after they've had an attack, it might entirely change their strategy and how important it is to the company's bottom line. And that case I used before, I think, is instructive. And I often try to repeat that, so I ask each of you to repeat it because it's a real case, which is the Farisi case. Let people know that if they mistakenly were in the 90% and assumed that they were dealing with a $500 extortion scheme, and it later came out that their data was used in a terrorist attack where people died, not only would they feel bad as citizens, it would be game over for the brand. They would have fundamentally mistaken their risk calculus on how to respond to the event. And in order to do that correctly, to do that analysis, they need the help of third-party, right now, third-party vendors who help on the attribution. But ultimately, they should be able to work effectively with government to get that information back and assistance on doing attribution.
Well, I'm just warming up now, and we're out of time. Perfect. So I want to thank you all very much for being here. Thank you to Dan, Kiersten, and John as well. And thank you to NS2 for hosting this event. And there's a lab outside, the Innovation Lab. I hope you all get a chance to swing by and share your ideas with what they've come up with. So thank you.
Thank you.